Well, hello everybody. Welcome. My name is Robert Douglas, and this is a episode of Deploy Friday. Deploy Friday is a web stream that we do every Friday to celebrate the joy of deploying your software on the best day of the week. Sponsored by my employer, Platform SH. And today, I have a great guest that I've been looking forward to speaking to ever since I was introduced to him. I want you to all to welcome, please, Anjuan Simmons to the show. Hi, Anjuan.
Hello, Robert. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So Anjuan and I met on Twitter, of all places. And I'm going to talk about the topic of the show and where we're going to go with it in a second. But I just think that it's great that in 2020, Twitter has been more relevant than ever for a lot of us. I've spent more time on Twitter than in my life, thanks to political situations, COVID. And one of the threads that caught my attention was this thread from, I think, June. It's in the comments for the YouTube video, at least. And I can probably paste it into the comments for all broadcasts right now, so you can go read that. And in this thread, Anjuan described what it's like to be a tech manager while being a Black man, basically, and how that is a different experience than what it might be like being a tech manager as a white man like myself. And I recognized in that thread that here is a person who speaks with an enormous amount of empathy and insight on the topic. And I also recognized in the thread that a lot of the things that Anjuan was talking about indeed did not apply to me as a person who enjoys the privilege of being a white male. And I just really wanted to get more insight from Anjuan, so I invited him to the show. Now, before we get into the topic, I should also introduce that Anjuan is a person who is an industry veteran in the tech scene. He cut his teeth with big companies like Accenture and Deloitte, and has since then been an entrepreneur and a tech manager for multiple organizations, is a speaker around the world, is a book author, and I'll come back to this book at some point, but I'll show it right now, Minority Tech by Anjuan Simmons. So this is a person who speaks with enormous authority, both on the tech topics, but also from the personal experience point of view. So Anjuan, welcome.
Yeah, so happy to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Would you give us a synopsis of that Twitter thread that brought us together, so that people can understand what the context about what I just said?
Absolutely. And like you, I've been using Twitter so much in 2020. I've always been a fan of the platform. I've been on Twitter since really the first year that it came out. And that tweet was really the deployment of a story. You know, I've worked in software for almost 25 years, and I love deploying code. I love shipping code because in many ways, when you ship code, you're shipping stories, right? We talk about user stories that we send off to our users to help them hopefully do things that are valuable and ideally that they delight in and love. And I always think about deployments as deploying stories to people who can benefit from them. And one of the unspoken stories of technology, though people are talking about it more, and that is the reality of being Black in tech. And I've been in engineering and software development for going on 25 years. I've been Black all my life. And so I've been at that intersection of being Black and a technologist. And I wanted to share in that tweet that unspoken story of being a Black tech leader. I've been leading teams since my Accenture days, right back in the 1990s. And so I've been in this experience of having to balance a couple of things. First, there's the reality that for a lot of the people who I lead, I'm their first Black manager. I'm the first person of color who they've had lead them. And so I have to take on the burden of being first, right? When we think about first, you know, we all know who the first president of the United States is. We all know who the first person on the moon was, because first means something. First mean that You've probably gone through a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of risk in being first. There's a lot of things that have been unproven. And so being the first Black manager means that there's a lot of things that are unproven in me, a lot of perceptions and risks that people feel when I walk into the door and I'm introduced as this person is the manager of that team. And, humans fear what we don't know. And we have, part of maybe our early history was feeling that the unknown is dangerous, right? The people over that ridge, across that river, we don't know who they are, and so we often fear them. But then, there's the idea that as a Black person, I think some people may see me as a token hire, that I just got this job because some person decided to embrace this diversity thing, and so I was brought in. And a number of people, in fact, too few people, believe that if a Black person has a job, then that means that a white person was denied that job, as if only white people are qualified and capable of doing work. So we add all of this, right? The burden of being first, the burden of being seen as a token hire, to the fact that I have to deal with stereotypes that people have about Black people. In Hollywood, you have the idea of central casting, which is an actual group that casts people for movies. And so when you have a movie about a young startup founder, well, they cast certain people. But if you have the idea of, I need to cast a thug or a gangster or a pimp or a prostitute, you cast certain other people, and those often go along racial lines. And so this burden that I talked about in that tweet stream is all about, I have to carry this burden as a Black leader, but I also have to do very complicated work too. I have to do the work of leading teams, understanding the technical environment, making sure everyone feels motivated and supported. So I have to do really two jobs: the job I was hired to do and the job of carrying this burden. If you watch science fiction, if you're a sci-fi nerd like me, to use a illustration from Star Trek, it's like going through a 5-year mission where you're constantly surrounded by a cloaked bird of prey that appear randomly and fire at you. And, instead of firing photon torpedoes, often as a Black leader, we get racism fired at us. And so if you're watching this and you think, wow, that sounds hard, that sounds unfair, I agree with you. And I like having this conversation. I want to thank you again, Robert, for having this conversation, because the only way that you can really get rid of this burden is by talking about it, right? If you ever gone through any kind of disease like cancer or any severe illness, the worst thing that you can do is to ignore it, not talk about it, right? It's often by talking about it that we can get to a place where we can begin to solve the disease and hopefully save the patient.
And did your Twitter thread actually get people talking about it? Was some of the resonance to you having basically that conversation, that narrative that you just gave us verbally? You gave that in a series of threaded tweets on Twitter. Reminder: the link is in the chat and on Facebook or on YouTube in the comments. Did you get a lot of feedback, positive, negative? What did people say?
Yes, I've gotten great feedback. If you look at the thread, you see some of the conversations that came from that. If you want to add to the thread or a reply, I'll see it and I'll be happy to continue it. And so it sparked a great conversation about that topic. And then I've been invited to shows like yours to come on and talk about this topic. So yes, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. And I think that I tweeted that in an environment where we had the murder of George Floyd. We had at that point the still unresolved murder of Breonna Taylor. We had all these things happening where I think that there was fertile soil for that tweet to go out. And so, yes, I think people felt that I explained things in a way that they had not thought about it. And then that, I think, activated them to think differently. But what my real hope is that we don't get people simply hearting or retweeting that tweet, but that people take action, that people feel that not only is this unfair, not only is this not right, but this is something I need to be involved in. And, if you've worked with Black people in tech, my story is not a new story. My story is not a unique story. The people who you either work with, maybe if you've had a Black manager, I can promise you that that person maybe not have exactly my experience, but there are definitely echoes and notes of that experience. And I really believe that everyone watching this has a role to play. in making the industry one where we can embrace talent, no matter what color that talent is, no matter the level of physical capability that talent has, no matter the gender of that talent, any measure. And that's why I'm so passionate about having these conversations, not only as a Black person, but as someone who is extremely much, very much an advocate for underrepresented groups to be given an opportunity to freely work in technology without the burden that racism puts on those groups.
So let's talk about the title of this broadcast. We've got it titled The BIPOC Experience in Tech. Can you define for us what BIPOC is? And you suggested that title. Why did you choose that term in particular?
Yes, so the term BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So it is an umbrella term to cover different groups that have historically been marginalized in tech. Most of the people who are watching this, you can see the marginalization in large part because you can see the low numbers of people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color in tech. And so I came on this show to, again, tell a story that often is not told. The story of BIPOC people in tech, but specifically the story of people who aspire to be leaders in tech. Often in technology, we try to classify the low rates and the low numbers of BIPOC people in tech because of some kind of pipeline problem. Well, Black people aren't interested in technology, or they're not interested in the hard math and sciences that you have to master to have a career in software development. I'm telling you, that's not true. I mean, so many groups, Kimberly Bryant's Black Girls Code, Code 2040, are working to harness the already existing interests that Black people have in technology, not just, Black people, but BIPOC people. And so, I don't believe in the pipeline problem at all. I think that there are systemic challenges that are keeping Black people from coming into the technology industry. But more importantly, when we get here, we often face, again, a lot of the things that I just described. There are stereotypes, there are prejudices that we have to encounter. And so a big factor that is often not talked about, and another story that's often not told, is the retention of BIPOC people in technology and all the forces that come into play that really make it really hard for BIPOC people to come into the technology industry, but also to stay, get promoted, and become leaders of the industry. That's why I wanted to come on to this show.
Yeah, thanks. So BIPOC is, if you scratch the surface here a little bit, then how companies more often talk about the issue of who they hire and everything. They usually say diversity. There are diversity initiatives. There are diversity targets. What do you think of when you hear the word diversity? What does that say to you?
Yeah, it says a few things. One, diversity is a start, right? It's a good starting place to have this conversation. To go back to BIPOC real quick, I think it's a useful term. I think that there are common challenges that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have had in this nation, in the United States, but I'm hoping this is also a global audience, and I think around the world too. When I think about the Aborigines in Australia, I think some of the First Nation people in Canada. So this is not a United States issue. I want to be clear that term is a useful umbrella term to talk about historical disenfranchisement, historical exclusion, but it doesn't mean that all these people are the same. Black people, especially in America, have had a very different set of lived experiences than Indigenous people, than people of color. And so it's really important that we use that term when it's useful, to talk about general oppression and exclusion and disenfranchisement. But we have to make sure that we understand the specific harm done to Black people, right? Over centuries, brought to this country in chains, forced to work for free, treated as less than human. Indigenous people here before colonists from Europe came here, drove them off their land, swindled them, got them hooked on alcohol, killed them, drove them, to the west. We have the Trail of Tears, and we have all this history, right? Very specific to indigenous peoples, and then people of color, other races that also were had different experiences. So I don't want that term to be one that people hide behind or misuse. It's a useful term as an umbrella term, but there really needs to be a direct understanding of how the groups of people inside that term have had specific harm, because there needs to be specific remedies based on that harm. But back to diversity. Diversity is a start. Diversity simply means that the representation of people inside of the technology industry should mirror the representation that we see it in the world, right? So in the world, roughly half the people on the planet are men, the other half are women, which means that you would think that in technology, half the people in the industry, from individual contributors who are just starting out up to CEOs, should roughly be split between men and women. Then you have the percentages for Black people and different groups. And so we find that we don't see that because historically there have been one dominant demographic, and we can get into why that demographic has been so dominant, that has been represented in technology. And so a lot of the efforts to make tech more diverse is to see what can we do to get those numbers in alignment with the reality of where people are in the world. But diversity is a bare minimum. It's like if you go to a restaurant and you order a certain set of things from the menu, and they bring you the right stuff, but you got the steak before you got the you got the appetizer after you got your entree, and then when you ordered the dessert, you asked for the gluten-free version, but they brought you the one that's not gluten-free, right? So you kind of got what you asked for, but the experience is off, right? And so diversity can easily be getting what you're asking for, but the experience isn't right. And I think that we have to go beyond diversity and go toward belonging, right? Belonging means that not only are we trying to get the numbers to reflect society, but we also want everyone to feel that they're coming into an industry that accepts them, right? That they're not being brought in grudgingly or because people feel some need that they have to do this, but we embrace the benefits of diverse perspectives, diverse points of views. We embrace the innovation bump that you get when you have multiple people with different ideas and backgrounds involved in the enterprise of the company, and that we want you to feel that you're in this because you belong here, because you have a place here. And so diversity is just the beginning. We have to think about belonging. I give a talk called Lending Privilege, where I talk about diversity and inclusion and how diversity is just kind of sending invitations, but inclusion is making sure people feel welcome. And not only that they're welcome, but that their interests and and that the things that they prefer are also provided. You might play their favorite song over the sound system at the party. But then there's the idea of not only belonging, but equity, right? Technology, specifically software development, and for those of you who work at SaaS companies, I mean, it is a rich and vibrant industry. We pay salaries that are very much above the average for most countries. SaaS companies are recession proof. I was reading this research paper just yesterday that showed that COVID-19 has had a big effect on all industries, but SaaS companies have thrived and have been able to navigate this.
Not the travel booking SaaS.
Not
the travel booking SaaS.
Software as a service, right? Those companies have done well. Great point. Just because of the need that, if you have a successful SaaS company, you have found a need and you are meeting, not just delivering features to users, but you are meeting their core needs and you're building something that they actually love to use, right? That's what successful SaaS companies, that's why Slack has been so useful. That's why other SaaS companies have been so useful, because they meet a core need. And so if we can make this industry one where all the equity that we are developing can be shared by people who have been historically disadvantaged, not only in getting a role in the company, but even getting a job. We can do so much to address the historic injustice done to these groups too. So that's one reason why I'm really keen to be, yes, an advocate for diversity, but also an advocate for belonging and sharing in that equity that I've enjoyed for almost a quarter century working in tech.
So you mentioned these goals, diversity goals. And aside from righting the historical wrongs, one of the reasons why I heard you say that an organization would embrace diversity goals is the innovation bump. I've heard other people make arguments that there's a direct ROI, return on investment, when you invest in your diversity as an organization, in your inclusiveness as an organization. What's your experience with that? Is there empirical data, and what do you mean when you say innovation bump?
Yeah, I mean, there is a ton of data. If you go to the Harvard Business Review, if you go to almost any publication that has honestly studied the industry, the evidence is overwhelming that the business case for diversity is strong. And all that means is that when we look at companies, let's go to SaaS companies again. This research I was reading just yesterday, they found that that SaaS companies that are led by women outperform companies that are led by men. However, these women-led SaaS companies raise less money, right? Because venture capitalists often don't invest in companies that are led by women, and so that means that you're failing to invest in that higher performance. So that is empirically true. That female-led companies, or I should say, companies led by women, across a whole host of measures, outperform companies that are led by men, but also companies where the gender mix is roughly 50-50. Those companies are more successful. They're ranked as being more innovative. They're more profitable. There is an overwhelming amount of research and evidence that diversity pays dividends. And if people aren't convinced of that, if you're watching this and you don't believe that, I mean, just tweet me and I'll be happy to send you mountains of links. But really at this point, if you don't believe it, it's not because of evidence, right? It's not because there's lack of evidence. It's because something in you is refusing to believe in this. And I'm not sure what that is, but I hope that you can, look inside yourself and see why that is. But again, it has to be beyond the business case. I did a talk for QCon Plus a few weeks ago. I was the inclusion and diversity track host for QCon Plus that just actually still going on. I was in week 1, and Shanita Sims, who I had the benefit of working for several months at a company, did a great presentation on we have to go beyond the business case for diversity. We have to root this work in justice. And Shanita runs a company called melanin.tech. If you just type in how you think it's spelled, you'll probably find it. That does a great amount of work, and she's doing a fantastic work in helping the industry become more inclusive and diverse. But she really made a great point that we have to root this in justice. That technology companies have to go beyond code. We have to go beyond financial statements, beyond profits and loss statements, and really see that we are involved in an enterprise that we're trying to change the world. And if you talk to these founders, they're going to say that yes, we want to change the world. We want to do all of these things. I think that has to apply to the injustices that have been done over so many years. And so I think that has to be a core part of how companies approach this.
So I think it would be hard to go to my leadership in the company and say, it's great that we have a diversity and inclusion officer in leadership. It's great that we have diversity targets, but we need justice targets. We need to rebrand that as justice as targets. So
yeah,
that's a hard sell for a tech company to formalize maybe. What's your general advice to tech companies regarding hiring in general? How should tech companies approach hiring? Should there be goals? Is that a new form of affirmative action? Is there blowback against that because of affirmative action was not always well understood or very popular?
Yeah.
what are the acceptable approaches towards achieving these goals, and what approaches aren't acceptable?
Yeah. So let's have an honest conversation about hiring. Especially when you're a startup, startups often say, we want to hire the best people, right? We want to hire the very best people. That's not true. Startup companies don't hire the best people. They hire the people who they know. And then when they hire those people, they hire the people who those people know. I've worked at startups. I have walked in and seen the vast majority of the people at that startup were hired because they worked with the founder at a previous company, or they knew the founder in some capacity. And because hiring works that way, that means that hiring is often, hiring runs along the same lines that our social circles do, which means that they're racially constructed, right? Most people know people who are their same race. Most people know people who are their same gender. That's why startups are overwhelmingly of the dominant demographic, because they're hiring people who they know, and they know people who look like them. And so if you want to say that we want to hire the best, why do you think that all the people who you know are the best, right? I mean, maybe you know some good people. Probably not everyone that you know is like best in class. And so because we also have that dynamic of having socially and culturally constructed guardrails around that guide and shape and really limit that hiring, then you have to wonder that, wow, I mean, how much racism is in my hiring? Probably more than you think, because most people don't see the racism and the sexism that forms their circle group. But if you think about it, especially if you're watching this and you're a startup founder, if you probably worked at a startup company, you probably lived in a neighborhood that wasn't very diverse. Well, there are reasons for that, right? Redlining was a practice in the United States where people who were selling houses and trying to build houses in neighborhood literally line off areas that were denied being sold to Black people. They literally said that we will not sell houses to Black people in this area. This practice was in place for decades. So if a Black person went to a real estate agent or to a builder and say, I have the money, I'm good, they were credit worthy, they were a nice family that you would want in that neighborhood, they were denied simply because of the color of their skin. Most White people don't know what redlining is, but you live in a neighborhood that maybe not was directly impacted by redlining, but there's a legacy of racism in where you grew up, which means that there's a legacy of racism in probably the people you're comfortable hiring. And so when you think about that and hiring as an act of injustice, that you inherited at least a lot of injustice, why would you want to continue that? But then you go beyond that into, yes, when you hire outside just the people who you know, and then that's when you can bring in the research. If you're not motivated by justice, you can be motivated by data, that when you go outside the people who you know and really hire the best, you get better benefits. So why would you not want that? Most startup founders would kill to get a 1%, a 2% increase in profitability. Research shows that diversity gives you that increase. Again, but if you're not moved by justice, if you're not moved by the numbers, then you should be moved by treating people well. I mean, not only is getting people to come into your company a hiring concern, but keeping people, right? Because when people leave, you have to hire to backfill for that role. And so many people of color, so many BIPOC people leave companies because they are exposed to racism. And they leave and they take their innovation with them when they leave. And so if you want to have a company where people feel comfortable being themselves, and I truly believe that people do their best work when it can be their authentic self, people can do their best work when it can be their true self, then you should invest in this work, because I hope I don't have to make a business case for treating people like humans. But part of treating people like humans is understanding the trauma that this world puts on certain groups of people historically and today. And so that's what I would say to the head of your companies, and to why hiring should be a concern for not only making sure that we're being casting as wide a net as we can, but also addressing injustice. Do I believe that you should set goals? I think you should. Should they be quotas? I think that quotas are unfortunately awash and inform with so much negative meaning that I probably wouldn't say that, at least on a internationally broadcast show like this. But I think that you should set diversity goals, because they're goals of they're really justice goals. They're really human goals. What can we do to treat the humans who are in our company as well as possible? But that means that you have to define, what does diversity mean to you? And it can't be a couple people in the leadership team who maybe have a diversity itch or an inclusion itch that they want to scratch. You have to get the company involved in defining, as a company, what does diversity mean? And you have to answer the question, why? I hope I've shared a couple good whys, right? You get some innovation. You can address a lot of the historical injustice that form the lives that we all live today, and maybe even have a part to play in reducing that injustice. Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think every company wants to hopefully exert a little gravitational pull to move that arc a little bit toward justice. And I hope that that helps you understand why you should invest in diversity. What does that mean? That means that you probably have to hire in places you're not hiring right now. You probably have to go beyond the frats, the fraternity you were in college, to look for talent, the people you work with now to look for talent. You probably have to go to different groups. Code 2040 is a great group to go look at. Historically Black colleges and universities, what we call HBCUs in the United States, a great place to go to. Black Girls Code, a great place to go to. If you don't know what those groups are, again, tweet at me. I will send you their links and other places that you can go. But I just want to be clear that by doing so, yes, you're going to get access to talent that people aren't looking for. And I think that, most people want to look for those untapped wells of talent, because there's a lot of it out there, and there's lots of sources of it, and it's in abundance. So you get access to that talent, but you're also bringing in their perspectives, you're bringing in their points of views, you're bringing ways of thinking that you probably don't have in your company. And if your company is a bunch of people from the same part of the world, the same race, you're probably getting similar ideas. And yes, there's a place for diversity of thought, but the richness of diversity, when you diversify racially and based on gender and drawing from the LGBTQ community and other groups, is so important. And so I've seen it, studies have seen it, almost anyone who's looked at this honestly has seen that it's worth investing in this. But again, I wouldn't tell your leadership to just do it for the business, do it for the profitability and the revenue, do it for justice, but do it because you want to create a more humane world. And
as you've been working on these topics throughout your career and have consulted and advised numerous organizations on their diversity and inclusion performance and initiatives, I recently found that you've developed a test.
The Valvia Test.
the Valvia Test for diversity and inclusion. Would you give us this test? And I invite our listeners at this point to close your eyes, and you can silently take this test for yourself, for your own organizations, and answer the questions and see how you fare.
All right, so let me do this in a scenario, right? So I'm Anjuan Simmons. I've been brought into your company. Usually it's to give my talk lending privilege, which I've been very fortunate to see people very, very strongly respond to in a very positive way. And so I've given my talk to your engineering department, maybe other people from different departments like HR also come to the talk. And then I'm brought after I give my talk into a little conference room, and you're sitting in the conference room with me and your leadership, and your leadership say, hey, Anjuan, we've really tried to embrace diversity and inclusion. How are we doing, right? Because you've walked into a lot of companies like ours, and you've given the talk, and you've seen how things are going. And so, I'll hear that question and I'll nod. And then if I see people in the room, and typically I see engineering managers and maybe a couple of VPEs, directors, right? So engineering managers that directly manage individual contributors or ICs, and I'll see managers of managers. So I'll look around the room and I'll say, how many Black women work in the software development function here at this company? Man, they'll say 0, right? That's instructive, and I'll share why later. But then a few people will say, oh, we have two Black women who work. One is a front-end developer, one works on our ops team. And then I'll turn to ideally the manager of managers, and I'll say, do you know who these Black women are? And often they won't even know their names. So like, I see them sometimes in the hallway, or they're on, when we have a town hall, I see their faces on Zoom in the grid view. And I'll say, well, do you know what they do? And they'll say, and often they'll learn in this conversation that they're front-end engineers or they're ops engineers. And then I say, okay, so you don't know what they do and you don't know their names. Do you think that they could do your job if given the opportunity, right? Because that's the key question, because that question shows, have they thought about these Black women? Have they seen and invested in their success? Because manager of managers, and again, I've worked with many managers of managers. I've been a manager of managers before. We know the people who are high potentials, right? Some industries call them high pots, high potential employees, right? We see them at the IC level. We keep our eye on them. We may have a couple skip levels with them that confirm their potential. And then we'll begin to do things to make sure that, okay, this is someone I'm watching, right? Watching to invest in. And the reason I ask that is because Black women are often the most disadvantaged groups in tech. Yes, Black people in general go through disenfranchisement. We go through not being treated well. We go through racism. But Black women as a group, because they are a double minority, right? They are Black and they're also women. And so Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the term of intersectionality, which means that the ways that identities stack and often multiply the harm. And so, again, I can share with you a ton of research into why this happens. But Black women are often the most disadvantaged when it comes to working in technology. So if you, as a company, if you can answer these questions in the Althea test well, yes, I know who they are. Yes, I've already identified their high potential. Yes, I see a path to them doing my job. That is like the most clear indicator I've ever come about to really see how you're doing. If you can't answer those questions, more than likely you have a long way to go. Especially if there are managers in the room who I'm talking to, if they can't answer all those questions well, that almost always means that they are well on their way, if not already there. They're having a healthy view of diversity and inclusion. The reason why I call this the Althea test is because one of the first Black people I managed was named Althea, and she was a fantastic part of my team. And as I've gone on to other companies, and as I've learned about the plight of Black women in technology, I just know that her journey was so hard. But despite the harshness of that journey, she was such a phenomenal part of that team that I led. And so that's why it's called that. But that's why the test is so useful in helping me to get a sense of where people are on their road to diversity and inclusion and really belonging.
Thank you. And I'd love to hear from the audience members who did the exercise internally as Anjuan was describing it. How'd you do? How'd your organization do? And did it stimulate any ideas about how you can look at your own organization differently from here on? Comments on any of the streams on YouTube, on Twitch, on Facebook, anywhere you're watching this, very welcome. And we can answer the questions that you have during the show. Absolutely. So Anjuan, let's say I wanted to do better on the Althea test in the future. And part of that clearly involves hiring Black women into the company. And I'm terribly distraught that I actually get a very small number of Black women applicants in my job queue. And you say it's not a pipeline problem. So what can I do as a hiring manager to correct that? Because maybe I'm just looking in the wrong places, as you say. Can you go further into that idea of looking into the right places?
Absolutely. Let me say this clear. Let me say this as clear as possible. If you have hiring responsibility at a technology company, you need to hire Black women, right? Let me say this again. You need to hire Black women for a whole host of reasons. One, if you are a Black woman in technology, you've overcome tremendous odds. You have a level of resilience and grit that few people have, right? And so not only do you have that, but you've had to double down on investing in yourself in order to make it in this industry. So Black women are some of the most resilient, tough, capable, intelligent people as a group. And again, this is not the stereotype. This is the archetype of Black women. There are many reasons I can go into that. But if you want a pool of talent that is probably the strongest that you've ever been able to find, you will find that pool in Black women. So let me just be clear on that. Is it hard? Yes. Why? Well, one, Black women know how tech companies are. So a lot of them avoid and actively do not want to be a part of the harm that tech companies have done to Black communities. And so you have to respect that skepticism. It's almost like you're part of a group that has historically abused another group. If you go to members of that group, they're going to be skeptical, right? They're going to be like, okay, every person, not maybe every person, but most people who I've seen who look like you, who have come to me, have harmed people who look like me. And so there is going to be that skepticism. I think like that is the hardest problem to solve. The pipeline problem is not a problem to solve. I think it's a fantasy problem. It's that skepticism. And so a lot of what you can do to hire Black women, and it's a bit of a chicken or the egg problem, but you have to cultivate Black women at your company. So if you have Black women working in your company, probably more than likely they're working unappreciated and they're doing a lot of the glue work. Tanya Riley, who I did an event called Lead Dev together with, and does a lot of Lead Dev events, gives a great talk on glue. Again, tweet me, I'll send you a link. And glue work is the work that often individual contributors do that's unnoticed, right? They're scheduling meetings, they're setting the agenda, they're doing a lot of the hard technical work that people know needs to be done but don't do. And again, I can't do the job that Tanya does. So if you don't know her, her Twitter account is Tanya, Tanya. Follow her. Black women do that glue work. They're often doing that work. So find them in your organization, give them the help that they need. If you ask them, how can I help you? They will probably let you know, but you have to do the help. You have to provide the help when they ask. And so provide a path for them to be promoted, because if you cultivate them, and again, this is not a neat, pat, quick solution. It takes time. This is months and quarters, possibly years. Cultivate their success. You will not regret that cultivation, and promote them, right? And by doing that, companies that promote Black women send a signal that this is a place where Black women are treated well, where we respect Black women. Black women will see that. The Black women in your company will hopefully, because you work to retain them, will let other people know in their networks that often are constructed to include a lot of other Black women, and they'll say, I found a safe place where we can lend our brilliance in this place freely. So like that's a lot of the work that you need to do. And you have to hire different places. I mentioned Code 2040, Black Earth's Code. There are many organizations that have a pool of extremely talented people, and they're looking for people to partner with. I did work earlier this year in where I volunteered to interview candidates for Code 2040. Code 2040, give a quick explanation of that because I realized that I didn't explain it. They're a group that exists to help partner people of color with technology companies primarily, and they set up basically an internship program, and they cultivate they're basically like a broker between communities of color and technology companies, and they link the two together. So they're a great group to invest in. And it's worth this investment. And I really want to do this commercial for Black women because, I mean, I came from a Black woman. I'm married to a Black woman. So I do have personal, as I'm the father to a future Black woman. But it is my experience and my understanding of what they go through. Stacey Abrams, who, if you're not from the United States, that's probably not a well-known name. Maybe even if you do know her, Stacey Abrams, through organization and grit and skills, probably changed the outcome of the last presidential election, right? And Stacey Abrams has all the traits of a Black woman that I've seen in every Black woman that I've ever met. Super smart, super tough, willing to lean into hard things, able to work in communities that often distrust each other and bring them together, right? And those are skills that you need in your company. And they are skills that Black women have in spades. And so you need to partner with groups like 2040. You need to find the Black women, improve your ability to answer the Valvia Test in your company, retain them, look and hire them. And I can promise you that you will get a transformational force that is hard to replicate in any other act that you can do as a company, possibly beyond doing another round of raising money. So yeah, I mean, that is my answer. And again, just to be clear, you need to hire Black women in technology for sure.
Thank you. So hey, we've got some questions from the audience. Let's take a moment to look at those. So Otavio Santana's asked two questions. I'll read them out and then we'll go into them. How about the process of hiring? How does it impact the candidate in diversity? And it's an extension. For example, a whiteboard, not everybody feels comfortable doing that. And we usually use an IDE in real life. So as I understand the question, Otavio is asking, are there methods of interviewing, hiring people that are impactful in terms of whether or not you're attractive to BIPOC people?
Absolutely. So I am a hiring manager as an engineering coach at Help Scout. Engineering manager is the title you see at most companies for what an engineering coach does, but there's other aspects that we bring into play. I'm very lucky to work with Leah Nobler. Leah's first name is spelled Leah, but pronounced like the princess. If Leah is watching, hello, my friend, how are you? Leah Nobler runs recruiting at Help Scout. And so I've partnered with her on hiring, right? I've had to hire people to my team. I'm very lucky to have someone as awesome as Leah. Help Scout is very much in a class of its own when it comes to hiring. And so we hire engineers, obviously. And so we have a process that can maybe describe at a very high level, because we could do a whole episode on hiring in general, especially hiring at Help Scout. But we have kind of what we call a value add interview, typically by someone like me, where I talk to the candidate, get a sense of their history, who they are, how they think about their career, how they think about working in software, how they think about working on teams. And that's just to get a general view of the person. And so I would say one of the things that you can do to make the hiring process less racially biased is to have a diversity of races of people doing the hiring. So having a hiring team that is not all one demographic is really important. So candidates respond well to that because it says a lot. And so once you pass the value add screen, once you pass me as the hiring manager, you go to the technical screen. I'll talk about a couple of things, like tell me about a feature that you developed that you're really proud of, or tell me how you think about code. But I'm not going to get into all the nuances like PHP, React, Kubernetes, etc. I'm going to send you to the next folks who actually are technical domain experts in, let's say, JavaScript, and then they'll do a technical screen, right? And that is very much a process, just asking questions. We don't do any kind of whiteboard interviews. I think whiteboard interviews are basically, can you memorize the spec for for a language, or how many pages of Stack Overflow have you memorized? I mean, it's not really useful. It's not something we do every day. And so, I think it's just very limited in the utility of what you get from whiteboard sessions. And then, so once you pass the technical screen, you do go to a project that we have in GitHub that you pull down. And it's a project that is meant to replicate a lot of the challenges that you will go through on our team. It'll have obviously some working code. There might be a couple of things that aren't working very well. And the goal of the project is to see, how do you think about this project? We pay people for their time because we know that interviewing is a work of labor, it's an act of labor. And then we give you time to work on this project, and then you turn it in. And then a team scores your code quality, how you comment in your code, what were your comments in the PR, and then we take that, and then if you pass that level, then you go to the final phase, which is the final interview, which at that point, usually it's a celebration. If there's any kind of, like, some people will thumbs up, some people will thumbs down, it's more of a conversation, but usually if you can pass all those phases, then you're pretty much, good to go. Does this work? Yes. Does it mean that we are slow to fill roles? Often it does. But we find that a slow hire is better than the wrong hire. How does this tie into diversity and inclusion? One, we cast a wide net. We do go to different groups to look for talent, which means that we diversify the people coming into our interview process. By not doing whiteboarding or whatnot, which you often have to have a lot of privilege. You have to have the privilege of working at a job where you have time to do that. You have to have the privilege of working in a job and having a personal life that is free of a lot of the distractions that often come with being Black, to be able to study and get ready for the interview. Black people, we often have to deal with a lot of challenges. I mean, I haven't gotten pulling over a lot in my life. I'm a pretty safe driver, but when I'm pulled over by a police officer, I'm aware that Black people are disproportionately killed by police officers in routine traffic stops, right? Most white people, especially if you're a white man, you're like, I'm pulled over again. Yes, just write the ticket and let me go. I'm busy. I got to go to a meeting, right? There's often like an aggression there that very few people. So, we have all kinds of stresses in our life that most white men don't even see or even know about. And so the privilege of not having that stress means that you have mind space, you have psychological safety, wells of psychological safety that you can put to getting ready to do a whiteboard interview. You can read the spec, you can get ready anyways. Not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that white people have it all easy, but it does mean that there are obstacles that you don't even have to worry about. And so I find that you get so much more by having a hiring process that is a little bit more personal and subjective. We do objectively test things, but we find that we get a more richer pipeline of candidates by having that process. And so that's why I like the process. And I think that if you diversify the sources you go to get talent, that is a great way of getting people into a process. But you really need to make upgrades to your process and make it more fair. So that is my answer to Otavio's question. Thank you, Otavio.
Yeah, and it seems to be an interesting topic to people watching. So Carlos has posted some follow-up questions, which I find very interesting. Mm-hmm. First, he asks, when does the world reach a state that could stop looking at color and gender to be looked at as inclusive? And then he follows up with, why not do blind interviews and selection to be considered the best strategy for getting inclusivity? And to that one, that's an interesting one, because before I was in the tech world, I actually played in classical orchestras. Oh, wow. And at some point, classical orchestras worldwide more or less adopted a behind the screen audition process where the panel would rarely see a candidate in the first, second, or third rounds when auditioning for a position in the orchestra, and only after they had been selected blindly from the larger pool would 2 or 3 candidates then be invited to play with the orchestra, because of course you can't just do tests. You actually have to sit and work with the people to know if you want to be their colleague as well. But at least the initial chance of sexism and or racism, and in the orchestra world, honestly, it was mostly sexism was the trigger for that, could be eliminated from that initial screening by having the blind audition. So Carlos is asking, is that a methodology for tech?
I am a huge fan of that, and here's why. There's ample research that shows that there's a ton of bias in hiring. Again, this is, I spend a lot of time convincing people that you have bias in your hiring process because you're hiring in a country that has racial bias all over it. You're hiring in an environment that has institutional racism baked into its bones. For example, there's ample research that shows that more ethnic sounding names don't get called back as much as ones that sound white, right? There's a study that, again, tweet me, I'll send you a link, and they did this in Chicago where they actually responded to actual job requests, and they had resumes that were identical in skills and qualifications. Some resumes, the name at the top was Emily, more of a white sounding name. Some it was Ebony, right? Very much an ethnically sounding names. Some of the resumes had Tyrone at the top, and then others had Timothy. Not that there aren't Black people named Timothy or Black people named Emily, but generally people draw distinctions when they see different names. And they found that the more ethnic sounding names or the more Black sounding names were overwhelmingly not called back, right? They were not responded to. And even though the skill sets were identical, if you have a Black sounding name, you reduce the likelihood that you will be asked to come for an interview, and then probably even if you get the interview, get hired, right? And that's just real rigorously, objectively proven truth, that Blackness counts against you when you're trying to get a job. So I think that things that you can do to remove as much bias as possible is to remove the name or any, because people can usually deduce, especially if you're hiring in your local area, what parts of town Black people live in general, and where the nice neighborhoods are. So I think even the address is important, but I would say that maybe not total blindness in the interview process, maybe like one eye cracked open, because you do have to, again, diversify your pipeline. You do have to go out and make sure that you're getting people coming into that blind process. So I do think you need to be intentional, at least in the upfront vetting and the upfront intake. Someone has to be looking for that. But once they're in and you vet that they're viable candidates, I do think it's important that you kind of remove as much bias as possible. And I think kind of having that little curtain that you described or something like that can be super, super useful. I do want to answer his other question, if that's okay.
Please.
So Carlos is saying, when does the world reach a state that could stop looking at color or gender to be looked at as inclusive? I want to live in that world, Carlos. I think we're far from that world for a few reasons. One, there are people who think we already are there. There are a lot of people who think we live in a world where skin color doesn't matter. We live in a world where, all of these things don't matter. And I'm like, well, then again, I'll show the research. Why do Black people who have Black sounding names not get the call back for an interview, even when we have empirically shown that the skill set is the exact same? Why do we have a wealth gap between Black households and Black households that has been unchanged since the Civil Rights Movement? I forget the number, and it's something like the average white household in the United States has the wealth of basically 5 of the average Black households, right? Why is that? It's not because Black people aren't working. It's not because Black people aren't working hard, but it's because there have been, for decades, if not centuries, institutional blocks put on Black people coming into the workforce. I have a degree from Texas A&M University. I have my MBAs, right? One of the best schools in Texas. It's a state college. The year that my mom, who's not an ancient woman, was born, Texas A&M did not admit Black people. She was like 12 years old the year that Texas A&M let Black people apply to be students. And, when you're 12 or 13, you're probably not thinking about college directly, but about college. And, so when she was probably thinking about college, Texas A&M wasn't even an option, right? A school that I went to and have a degree from. This is not ancient history, but think about it. If my mother could not think of Texas A&M realistically as an option, there were millions of Black people during that time who are still alive today who couldn't go to that institution, who could not get a credential that would help them get access to wealth and great jobs. And think about the people who were my grandmother and great grandmother, right? Who for centuries were not allowed to do what they wanted to do to create wealth for themselves and for their forebears. And so that meant that other races had centuries to get ahead that we were blocked from. That's why we have that truth of education disparities, and we have Jim Crow laws, and we have finding the civil rights movement, but we still have things that are built into the system that work against us. That's why we have the wealth gap. That's why we have the education gap. That's why we have a lack of representation of Black people in technology. And how will we be, when will we know, when will we reach a state where we can stop looking at color and gender to be inclusive? Well, we will know we're there when color can't be used against Black people, when that wealth cap disappears, or at least gets a lot lower, when the education gap disappears, where we can't create a study that shows that Black people aren't called in for the interview if they have a Black sounding name. Some Black people use their initials to combat this, right? That's when I know that we'll get there. We can go back to inclusion just meaning humans and not different races and not different genders.
So, Anjuan, we're at the top of the hour, and technically we should stop. But if you have 5 more minutes, I've been saving a more personal question for you for this point. And if you have the time, I'd love to ask it.
I have the time, and I have something I want to share in response to your question. So let's go.
Fantastic. So coming back to the book that you wrote, Minority Tech, which I can recommend, it's on Amazon.
Thank you.
As I was reading that, you describe your experience of the shooting of Trayvon Martin in 2012. Yeah. And at the beginning of the episode, you mentioned George Floyd as something that happened this year and triggered lots of protests. And for people who don't remember Trayvon Martin, I certainly do, that was also a shooting of a Black man that triggered enormous protests throughout the United States and maybe even worldwide. And I think it might have been the beginning of the Black Lives Matters movement. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but my question on that is, when George Floyd was shot and you saw the outcome of that, did you feel like it was 2012 all over again? And do you feel like we've progressed?
Trayvon Martin was my Emmett Till. If you don't know who Emmett Till was, he was a Black person killed a young boy. And actually, tweet me, and I'll tell you the story. You should know Emmett Till's name. He was in the 1950s, right? He was the Trayvon Martin that was a big part of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And then, and so George Floyd was the Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin for a lot of people who went out into the streets. Do I think we've made progress? I think we've made a little. I think that there's a long way to go. I have an acronym that I've come up with called HELP, right? HELP. And if you want to do more than just turn the profile picture on your Twitter account or Instagram Black, or put a Black square on Instagram, or maybe put Black Lives Matter on the street, because those are nice, but they're not sufficient. Those are just performative allyship. If you want to be an ally to Black people, if you find that what I share with you is compelling, that you feel that, wow, I now have my eyes open to the plight of Black people in technology, then you can help, right? Part of that is the history. There's so many parts of the history that we don't know. We're not really taught world history, or especially American history in the United States, right? We may talk about slavery, but we don't talk about the massive destruction done to a group of people purely on skin color. I can share with you resources. Like I said, tweet me and I'll share with you, but you have to do the hard work of understanding the history. That will lead you to the E in help. That's empathy. And empathy is not sympathy, right? Sympathy is just like, oh, I'm sorry you're hurting. Empathy is, you know what, I hurt with you. And I think that once you understand the history, you'll begin to feel some of that hurt that Emmett Till caused people to feel, Trayvon Martin caused people to feel. George Floyd caused people to feel. I'm afraid there will be another person not too long from now who will be killed unarmed by the police, that people will feel that pain. You have to feel empathy. But once you do that, you are in a position to listen. And I do that, and I strongly suggest that, you use whatever sources you can. Twitter is a great resource. A lot of people on Twitter. Find people who do what you do, who don't look like you. Find Black people. If you're a DBA, if you're a sysops, if you're a front engineer, if you're a back engineer, Black people exist everywhere doing everything. You can find them if you do 10 minutes of searching on Twitter. Follow them, listen to them, learn from their experiences. You'll see that they're just like you. They just have obstacles that you don't have to worry about. I think once you understand the history, and you can form some empathy, and you can listen, then you can start to provide. You can see where you can provide help. And that provision is very much probably the help that you got. Someone helped you get that interview. Someone looked over your resume, your cover letter before you sent it in. Someone sat with you and did mock interviews. Someone sat and tutored you in React. Once you listen and you are able to share that their experiences, you'll be welcomed in that providential care that you can provide. And it won't be instant, right? There's a lot of skepticism that you'll find, and it's valid. But by understanding the history, by developing empathy, and by listening, you'll be able to provide, and you'll be a part of what I think we can all do, which is exert that gravitational pull that will help us bend the arc of the moral universe closer to justice.
Thank you. You had something to follow up with that. What's that?
Oh, that's it. It's that help acronym. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
So you give it to me, and hopefully I knocked it off the tee.
Yeah. So Anjuan, thank you so much for being my guest. And we will follow up with anybody who has further questions, either on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, wherever you're interacting with us. And hope to see you around in the tech world soon, maybe even in person after all these crazy travel restrictions are lifted. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. It was a pleasure. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Anjuan, at Anjuan. Let's continue the conversation.
Great. Bye-bye, everybody.